Now, I have, as Glees pointed out, this is my 8th lecture, so I have to try to remember what I've said and what I haven't said. Have I described to this group the catch-22 of American politics and why a Southerner could never get elected president?
Yes.
Okay, those of you who've heard me say this, nod or raise your hand or something so I'll know. Okay, a few of you? All right, well that's not enough, so I'll go ahead and tell the story anyway. But I'll elaborate a little bit more this time. Because I have to explain how Lyndon Johnson came to be president and how Lyndon Johnson finally managed to push through civil rights legislation. Is this familiar to some of you? Yeah, but okay, anyway. Oh yeah, I remember what I said, okay. Actually, what I'll do is I'll just kind of cut to the chase. Lyndon Johnson became president in 1963 by the tragedy that befell his predecessor, John Kennedy, who was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And how many of you have been to Dallas, to Dealey Plaza in Dallas, and seen the site, the assassination? Speaking as somebody who's lived in Texas, I can tell you that Texas has been, not so much recently, but for a generation, was horribly conflicted about this assassination. Because those of you who've been to the site, have you been to the 6th floor museum?
Yes. Yes.
If you visit the museum, you can see some downright scurrilous headlines in Dallas newspapers bitterly opposed to John Kennedy. John Kennedy was a Democratic president. Texas was a Democratic state, and Dallas was a Democratic city in a Democratic state. But John Kennedy was bitterly opposed. I should almost say violently opposed, but that would give credence to the conspiracy theories. However, there were people in Texas, in Dallas, who cheered when they heard that John Kennedy had been killed. They were so bitterly opposed to everything that John Kennedy stood for. But the death of John Kennedy allowed Lyndon Johnson to be president. Oh yeah, wait a minute, where was Johnson from? Texas. Okay? This is what gives rise to the conspiracy theories. It's a little bit too convenient. This guy that the Texans hate is killed, and a Texan becomes president. Well, they wouldn't have been cheering if they had known what Lyndon Johnson had in mind. Because Lyndon Johnson had in mind nothing less than the dismantling of Southern society and culture. Lyndon Johnson intended to take on the system of Jim Crow. Now we get into the question of motives. What causes people to do what they do? What causes presidents to choose the courses of action that they choose? What motivated Lyndon Johnson to be the great hero of American civil rights? The Abraham Lincoln of his day. Now, I realize that there are a lot of fans of Abraham Lincoln that would just roll over in, well, maybe not their graves, they're still alive, Lincoln's grave, to hear Lincoln compared with Lyndon Johnson. But in fact, a very strong argument can be made that Lyndon Johnson completed what Abraham Lincoln started. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, but he certainly didn't change Southern attitudes on race. And the attitude change required another 100 years at least. And Lyndon Johnson decided that he was going to be the agent of that change. How many of you have read any of the volumes, the 3 volumes so far, on Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro? If you're looking for a really good read on presidential history, read Caro. Caro knows how to tell a story. He kind of warps the story. He writes, I like sometimes think he writes opera rather than history, because it's very clear that there are heroes and there are villains. And strangely enough, in his first couple of volumes, Lyndon Johnson is a villain. Lyndon Johnson almost literally wears the black hat. But this sets us up, I have to assume. He hasn't gotten to the vice presidency, the presidency yet. He's said to be working on it. He's been working on it for 25 years. But is Hank Meyer here, by the way, this evening?
No.
I was just going to tell Hank, don't worry, there's hope. Caro's been working on Johnson for 25, so you got a long way to go. Anyway, he sets Johnson up as this villain, I think the better for his redemption to occur. I was talking to a writing workshop out at the Allendale campus last evening, and I was talking to the students out there. It was a creative nonfiction writing workshop. And we were talking about what constitutes creative nonfiction. We got to talking about memoirs and the like. And this brought up, any of you read the Confessions of San Agustin? It's sort of a classic of Western literature. And it's the story of this really dark-dyed sinner who embraces the gospel and becomes a father of the church. But it's a great story in that it's a wonderful book to read, and you all should read it. Even those people who don't care about the conversion part. Because the part that he tells about his days of dissipation are terrific. And the dissipation is all the darker because it makes the conversion even better. I've been trying to make a similar argument to my Texas friends. I wrote a book a few years ago on the Texas Revolution. And you probably, maybe you don't know what the Texas Revolution was, but it was the Battle of the Alamo and the stuff that happened before and after that. And in all honesty, I described the heroes of the Alamo before they become heroes of the Alamo. And people like William Barrett Travis, people like James Bowie, even people like Davy Crockett, these were not upstanding citizens of the Republic. In fact, if I told you some of the things that Bowie and especially Travis had been up to, well, I'd have to ask the younger people in the audience to leave the room. And for the rest of you, your ears would burn red. These were not upstanding characters. And sometimes my Texas audience, parts of my Texas audience, really take issue with my telling this part of the story, and they're quite offended because I'm talking about the heroes of Texas history. But I try to explain. In fact, it makes the story better. It makes their heroism greater if they were these dastardly characters, as indeed they were. And then on that one morning, March 6, 1836, Alamo Day, and it's honored in Texas history and politics. In 90 minutes on that morning, these very checkered individuals become great heroes. And the reason, it seems to me, that the story is so much more compelling that way is that it basically says we all can be heroes. As ordinary, as imperfect as we might be, there's hope for us. This is the message of St. Augustine's Confessions. And I confess at this point that I've really lost my train of thought as to where this digression started. So let's see. Oh, yes, Lyndon Johnson and his conversion. His conversion awaits. We're hanging on Volume 4 to see what Caro's going to come up with. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson decided that he was going to take on the system of segregation in the South. Why? Well, he had grown up. He liked to say that he had grown up poor in the Texas Hill Country. Well, not poor by Hill Country standards. And the Texas Hill Country, if you haven't been there, is picturesque but not a good place to make a living. Even the goats have a hard time finding anything to graze on. But Johnson's family was quite middle class by Hill Country standards. Even so, Johnson himself felt at a disadvantage, at a social disadvantage to other people in Texas. He went to what is now called Texas State University, what until a couple of years ago was Southwest Texas State University, and before that was Southwest Texas Teachers College. That's where he went. He simply went to a teachers college. And by the time he got to Washington, he found himself surrounded by people who had degrees from Harvard and from Yale and from the University of Michigan. And Southwest Texas Teachers College, where's that? They looked on Lyndon Johnson as a hick.